In the Adventist Encyclopedia, which now is 2 volumes instead of 1, it's part of the Adventist Bible Commentary series, there's a little article that runs 5 or 6 inches in one column on the shaking, and it says that in Adventism, Adventist Christians who are interested in end-time events, that this shaking is a tragic failure in apostasy under the metaphor of a shaking, a period immediately preceding the second coming when many members will leave the Adventist church for 3 reasons, at least. First, indifference. Second, satanic deception. And third, the pressure of circumstances which they seem either unable or unwilling to resist. The period is also referred to sometimes as a sifting time or a testing time by Ellen White. And the Adventist Encyclopedia goes on to say that this expression, the shaking, probably finds its genesis in 2 references in the Old Testament and another 2 references in the New Testament which refer to a shaking as a metaphor. The first one is Isaiah 17:6 in the Old Testament, where Isaiah uses the metaphor, the shaking of an olive tree. Ezekiel picks up on that in Ezekiel 38:19, and he makes an application. He speaks of a great shaking in the land of Israel. In the New Testament, John, on the island of Patmos, in Revelation 6:13, speaks of a fig tree shaken in a mighty wind, maybe a takeoff on what Paul speaks of in Hebrews 12:26 and 27, where he says that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. I would be embarrassed tonight to tell you how late into my ministry I was before I discovered that the basic principal turf in the New Testament on the shaking is found in our Lord's parable of the wheat and the tares. It was quite late in my ministry. I was interested, for many years I have taught a course to our college students, both in West Africa as a missionary. We started our seminary in Nigeria, and then later at Pacific Union College, before I went to the seminary, went to the General Conference in the White Estate, course in the life and teachings of Jesus. And every year we would talk about this parable of the wheat and the tares. And I was very interested as I was rereading it in preparing for our message this evening, rereading it to notice that Ellen White makes some interesting applications of the symbols in that parable. First of all, the field in many of the parables of Jesus represents the world. But in this particular parable, the author of Christ Object Lesson says, the field represents the church in the world. Normally it's the world, but in this parable, the field represents the church of Christ in the world. The seed sower, of course, is Jesus. The tare sower, the weed sower, is, of course, Satan. The good seed, the wheat, are the loyal children of God's kingdom as found within the church. Not just good people out there in the world. The wheat represents the loyal children of God inside the church. And the tares, by contrast, represent disloyal Christians who are also within the church, not just merely the wicked out there in the world. The reapers are the angels, the harvest is the end of the world. And both wheat and tares grow together within the church until the harvest. And then we come to where the rubber hits the road, as they say. The harvest is the end of the world, and Jesus said, in the time of the harvest, but before the harvest actually takes place, the wheat gathered into the barn, the righteous taken to heaven. In the time of the harvest, the angels first, and that's Jesus' word. Paul will use that word first too. We'll come to that in a minute. The angels first, in the time of the harvest, the angels first gather and then bind the tares into bundles to be burned, and only after this is done first do the angels gather the righteous at our Lord's return. And this gathering of the tares symbolizes the final shaking of the church. Now, the subject of the shaking was a subject of consuming interest to the Apostle Paul. I find it interesting that his 2 major references to it happen to be in the very earliest of his writings and also in the very last of his writings. It was a concern throughout Paul's entire ministerial career. Now, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, particularly verses 16 and 17, Paul introduces the harvest, the second coming. 1 Thessalonians was probably the first book of our New Testament to be written chronologically. It was written certainly 20 years before Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote their Gospels, and then John came along and wrote his Gospel 30 years after Matthew, Mark, and Luke. 1 Thessalonians is the oldest letter that is still in existence of Paul that we have. He wrote one letter to the epistle to the Laodiceans. We don't have it. Some people think it may be Ephesians, but we don't have that. But of the letters which have survived from Paul's pen, 1 Thessalonians is the oldest and also probably the oldest book of the New Testament. And in 1 Thessalonians 4, he talks about the harvest. Then 6 months later, he writes 2 Thessalonians to pick up on where he left off in 1 Thessalonians. They needed instruction about the second coming. And in 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 1 to 3, I'm reading from the New King James Version, 2 references. We ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled as though the day of Christ had come. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away come first. Here he's using the same word Jesus did in the parable of the wheat and the tares. In the time of the harvest, the angels first gather the tares, which is a symbolic representation of the final shaking of the church. And now Paul is using that very same word, first. He says there's first going to be a shaking, a falling away in the church of Christ before Jesus comes. That was the first 2 letters that he wrote. In one of the last letters, 1 Timothy chapter 4, he starts out in verse 1 by saying that the Spirit speaks expressly. Let me stop there for a minute. I am fascinated by that. Because everything that is in the Bible is there because the Spirit was speaking expressly. It's all spoken expressly by the Holy Spirit. That's why it's there. Paul is going to great pains to reinforce this fact on his hearers by saying the Spirit speaks expressly that in the latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceptive spirits and doctrines of demons. And I find it interesting that he refers to one of the causes of this shaking as false doctrines, doctrines of demons, because tomorrow morning in the Sabbath school hour, we will really have Sabbath school tomorrow. In that presentation, I'm going to talk about the 4 causes of the shaking as I find them identified and elucidated in the writings of Ellen White. And one of those 4 causes of the shaking is false doctrines from inside the church. Well, apostasy, sadly, is a fact of life in the Christian church almost as old as the history of the Christian church. Ellen White, in Desire of Ages, in her chapter on the ordination of the 12 disciples to gospel ministry, makes a point of saying that the very first step in the organization of the Christian church was the ordination of the 12. And I've been, in my 52 years of ministry, I have been privileged to participate in, and sometimes even lead out in an ordination service, and I'm always deeply moved by such opportunities. I think the Holy Spirit comes especially close. She said that was the first step. The second step was taken probably the same morning down below when Jesus preached his Sermon on the Mount, which is the constitution, or to use Ellen White's term, the charter of the Christian church. The first 2 steps in the organization of the Christian church. It was not long after that, over on another shore of the Sea of Galilee, that many men and women and children came to hear Jesus speak, and he spoke to them all day. Toward the end of the day, some of the disciples were probably feeling pangs of hunger. I know I would have if I'd been there, hadn't eaten all day. And they said, Lord, maybe we ought to break up and let the people go try to find some food. There are no supermarkets around here, no stores nearby, and the people are getting hungry. And Jesus said, give ye them to eat. And they looked at him like they thought he was out of his tree. And they said, we don't have anything to give them. You know, Matthew and Mark make an interesting point, and I'll bet you probably passed your eye right over it without registering it. When you read about that in Matthew and Mark's Gospel, it says Jesus fed 5,000 men. In Bible times, women literally didn't count. When Jesus fed 5,000 men, Ellen White said the total audience was upwards of 10,000, which is doing pretty good with 5 fish and 2 loaves out of a peasant boy's lunchbox. Well, they saw, the disciples saw, here's the opportunity now. Judas was the one who 5 loaves and 2 fishes. I got it the other way around, didn't I? Judas was the one who was kind of acknowledged as the leader of the 12 disciples, not by Jesus, but by the 12 themselves. He was the best educated. He was the best connected with the hierarchy in Jerusalem. I mean, Judas had so much going for them, and these other fellows, pardon me, they maybe had been to synagogue school there in Capernaum. But Judas probably had a bachelor's degree, at least. He was a scribe. And Judas calls the 12 together. 10,000 people being fed by 5 loaves and 2 fishes from a peasant boy's lunchbox. And Judas said to the disciples, okay, the people are really awed by this. Let's take advantage. Let's capitalize on this moment. He says, let's take him by force. Now, Jesus is too modest a fellow to assert himself. I mean, what is he doing? He's spending his time talking about the birds of the air and the lilies of the field when the oppression of Rome is grinding his heel on us more and more. Everybody, including the disciples of Jesus, including the disciples of John the Baptist, including John the Baptist himself, believed that when Messiah came, he was going to set up a geopolitical kingdom. He was going to throw the Romans out and restore the lost glory of David's reign 1,000 years before. And so Judas says, look, this chap is too modest, too self-effacing. Look, we're going to have to take him by force and crown him and get on with the revolution. And they said, yeah, okay, let's do it. So they started, Judas leading the group, they started toward Jesus. And friends, when you're reading Desire of Ages, you are reading an eyewitness account. Ellen White tells us in that marvelous book, she says that when Jesus saw them coming, he intuited immediately what they were about. And she said he spoke to them with an authority he had never exercised, must have really surprised them, with an authority he had never before exercised. And he said, stop right where you are. Dismiss the people, send them home. You go home, I'll see you there tomorrow. And he did. And John's Gospel says the very next morning was a Sabbath. So this happened on a Friday. The very next morning was a Sabbath in Capernaum, and Jesus was the guest speaker in the synagogue in Capernaum. If you go to Israel today, on the shore, very close to the shore of the Sea of Galilee, there is a 1st century Roman architecture style synagogue, 1st century synagogue. Now, I don't know whether that's the one in which Jesus preached this famous sermon recorded in John chapter 6. But if it isn't, it's very much like it. And in John chapter 6, we are given just a little bare bones, itty-bitty outline of what Jesus said in a sermon which was probably entitled, Eating the Flesh and Drinking the Blood of the Son of God. And Ellen White, Desire of Ages, said Jesus had one goal in that sermon and one goal only. He wanted to explain to the people once and for all that the nature, thank you, that the nature of his kingdom was spiritual. My kingdom is not of this world. And furthermore, mine hour has not yet come. It will, but it had not yet come. And that's why he told the disciples to send the people home, and they were to go home. He was going to put an instant stop to this move to make him king. They understood clearly, and they didn't want to hear what they heard. This is a hard saying. Who can bear it? Who can hear it? Who can understand? Who wants to hear it? And in John 6, verse 66, many turned their backs on him and walked away from Jesus. If you had been there, If I had been there, would you have turned your back on Jesus and walked away? Can you think of the enormous implications of turning your back on Jesus? Well, people today in the church turn their back on Jesus and walk out. That's what the shaking is all about, dear friends. Turning your back on Jesus and walking out the door of His house. And Jesus succeeded tremendously successfully in His single goal to explain to them. They didn't want to hear it. They tried to say He's teaching cannibalism. Desire of Ages says those people knew better because their own teachers often used the metaphor eating the flesh and drinking the blood to describe spiritual life. And Jesus' kingdom was spiritual. It wasn't going to be geopolitical. And so it was that many turned their backs. And as Jesus saw them going away, up until this point, His crowds have been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, watershed. His crowds are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And He turns to the disciples and He says poignantly to them, "Are you going too?" And bless his heart. Peter sometimes had foot-in-mouth disease, but he didn't this time. He got it right this time. Bless his heart. "Are you going too?" Peter speaking for the 12. He said, "Lord, where would we go? We've been down the street. We've heard the rabbis. We've heard the scribes. We've heard the Pharisees. We've heard the leaders. Every time we go to them, we walk away in greater uncertainty than we came because they equivocate. Well, this text may mean this, but on the other hand, it may mean that, or it may mean this, and nothing was certain. Nothing stood out in stark, clear lines. Boy, nobody ever said that about Jesus. No man ever spoke like this man. He called a spade a spade." And that's why the people loved to hear Him. He was simple, He was direct, He was to the point, and He was heavenly in His preaching. Wouldn't you have loved to hear Jesus preach that Sermon on the Mount? I would have sat there all day entranced. Well, are you going to? No, where would we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. And they stayed with Him for the time, for another 3.5 years. But the time would come when Judas would betray Him, and when the other 11 would all forsake Him and flee, to use Mark's terse expression. Jesus had His Judas. And after the ascension to heaven, that early New Testament church, the landscape of that early church was littered with the wreckage of apostasy. Peter had his Ananias and Sapphira. Paul had his Demas, disciple who initially followed him and then defected. Demas's name appears 3 times and 3 times only in Paul's writings in the New Testament. The first time he is solidly in the church, the next time he seems to be wavering, and the next time Demas has left me, having chosen this present world, Paul said. In 2 Corinthians 11:24-26, Paul identifies 8 perils that he faced in the early Christian church, and 2 of them have to do with a shaking. One of them was in perils of mine own countrymen. That must have been difficult. But the one that probably was the hardest to bear, Paul said, in perils of mine own brethren in the church. In 1850, Ellen White made the first reference to the shaking in her writings. Now, 2 years before, 1848, she saw bits and pieces of the great controversy drama unfold. But it would be 10 years, exactly 10 years, 1858, March 13, Sunday, Lovett's Grove, Ohio. Today you'd say Bowling Green. Lovett's Grove is a little small suburban hamlet of Bowling Green today, only a couple of miles from Bowling Green State University campus. I've been there a number of times, been there to pray. The spot where Ellen White had the great controversy vision. On a Sunday afternoon, 2-hour vision that interrupted a funeral. I've got a long list and a short list of questions to ask Jesus when He comes. This isn't on the short list, but it is on the long list. Lord, why did you interrupt a funeral for a 2-hour vision? Couldn't you have given her the vision just before the funeral? Or couldn't you have given her the vision just after the funeral? Lord, why did you interrupt a funeral for 2 hours? People don't want to sit around at a funeral. Well, He'll have an answer. And His answer will satisfy me someday, and it'll satisfy you when you ask Him your questions. Jesus always satisfies. He has a reason for everything, Sometimes that reason is opaque. Sometimes it is very unclear to you and me. But He has a reason, and it's a good reason. And someday, friend, if you're faithful, you'll be able to walk along the bank of that river of life. Maybe sit down under the tree of life with Jesus. And you'll have your chance to ask your long list and your short list of questions. Why was that funeral interrupted for 2 hours? He'll have an answer. But there were two things about that vision at Lovett's Grove, Ohio, March 13, 1858. There were two things that were different from 10 years earlier, 1848. She was only 4 years into her ministry at that time. Two things were different. This time, for the first time, she saw the whole thing. She only saw bits and pieces before, 10 years earlier, bits and pieces. It was almost like it was given for background information. So this time she saw the whole thing. That was different. And this time, another thing that was different, the angel said to her, you got to write it out. He hadn't told her that 10 years before. And so in 1858, she has this vision. And as a result, the book that came from it, 219 pages, called Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1. There is, toward the back of the book, pages 183 to 188, chapter 32, a little chapter entitled The Shaking, 1858. And in 1862, she was writing a letter to Elder Moses Hull, and I'm going to come back to him in a little bit. We're going to talk about Moses Hull a little more tonight. In a letter to Elder Hull, I saw that we are now in the shaking. Now, she had said that in 1850 in early writings. The mighty shaking has commenced and will go on, and all will be shaken out who are not willing to take a bold and unyielding stand for the truth and to sacrifice for God and His cause. Then in 1862, she says, I saw that we are now in the shaking, and Satan is working very diligently. Ellen White uses two expressions, and some see them a little differently from some others. The expression, the shaking, and the sifting. And there are two schools of thought, at least two schools of thought on the subject. And a friend of mine, Joseph W. Sharp, who was a layman but very interested in things theological, wrote a little monograph of 8 pages, published it himself, entitled The Shaking. And Joe Sharp sees it this way. He sees the shaking and the sifting as two closely related events, but separate, but closely related. He says preceding the sifting is an experience called the shaking. So the shaking precedes the sifting. The shaking takes place within the church and separates the members into two groups. Then the sifting follows and serves to remove one group from the church. This is an analogy predicated on an ancient method of separating the wheat from the chaff at harvest time. So he sees them as two separate, discrete events, but very closely related, both in association and in time. Other people see Ellen White using these terms almost interchangeably as if they were synonyms, and I have to confess that that's the way I see them. But I am interested in Brother Sharp's analogy here. But whether it's that way or whether it's another way, I think Brother Sharp would agree with me that what Ellen White had to say about the final shaking of the church can be summed up in 5 statements, 5 general statements. Statement number 1. The final sifting of Adventism was a process that had begun and would continue to progress in Ellen White's church during her lifetime. Secondly, it would not only continue, it would accelerate until the close of probation. Third, it would have at least 4 causes, and we're going to talk about those 4 causes in the 9:30 service tomorrow morning. The final shaking would have at least 4. Maybe some of you may find more than 4. I have, in my research, come up with 4. And in turn, these 4 causes would produce various effects. Number 4, at the end of its course, the final shaking would separate a substantially large number of members from the fellowship of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And 5, this would not, however, be a terminal illness for the remnant people of God. Why? Because while a very significantly large number would leave the church, we're going to talk about that more tomorrow especially, while a large number go out, an equally large, or even larger, I can now make the case from my research that the number who come in while the shaking is going on and shaking out, a very substantial number, that the number coming in will even be larger than the number going out. And when the dust of the shaking settles, the church will have more members than it had before, though the identity of any individual Adventist might be quite different from the beginning to the end of that process. Because the latter rain will be poured out, the loud cry will follow. We're going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow. With regard to the time of the final shaking, the shaking began early in Adventist history. Notice I didn't say Seventh-day Adventist history. See, Ellen White had her first vision on an unknown day in December of 1844. We know the month, we know the year, we don't know the day. It's lost to posterity. But we do know how old she was, because she was just barely 17 when God called a pork-eating Sunday keeper to prophetic ministry, and never, in the first vision, never said boo about what was the right day to keep, nor never said anything about vegetarianism and the desirability of it, and certainly the exclusion of pork. Those would come later. That wasn't God's highest priority on that unknown day in December of 1844. We didn't take the first steps in organization until the year 1860, which is remarkable because Ellen White's first vision on the need for organization was Christmas Eve of 1850, exactly 10 years earlier. Now, the people believed she was getting visions from God. They believed her messages were from God, and yet it took 10 years of visions and messages before we took even our first few feeble steps in church organization. Now, that's another topic all of its own, and there are reasons. But we won't get into that tonight. We took our first steps in May of 1860. We had our first legally organized church in Parkville, Michigan. And I was just happy a few weeks ago to be up in Battle Creek and to see that they have moved that building up to Advent Village. If you ever get anywhere near Battle Creek, you must go and see Advent Village. And don't leave town until you've seen Kellogg's Cereal City. I was surprised and astonished when I went to Cereal City. It's a big kind of an illustrated museum to see large pictures of Ellen White and John Harvey Kellogg and early pioneers of this church, and to read the laudatory statements. Now, if they had been written by a Seventh-day Adventist, I could certainly understand why, because we have an axe to grind. But this non-Adventist historian who wrote about Ellen White had no axe to grind. He's not an Adventist. But he wrote some of the most impressive words about the founder of our church, co-founder. James White and Joseph Bates are viewed as the other two of the three co-founders of our church. It's very interesting things to see there. But we didn't do all that. We didn't take the name Seventh-day Adventist until October 1, 1860. They had a special meeting in Battle Creek and said, we got to have a name. One of the biggest contenders was Church of God. But Ellen White said Seventh-day Adventist is what the name should be. She says it carries the distinctive doctrines of our church right up in the front. And so that's what we've been called. So there wasn't a Seventh-day Adventist church technically until 1860. 7 years before we took our first steps in organization, we had the first apostasy in the Advent movement. There was something called the Messenger Party. It was led by three guys named Case, Russell, and Hall. They opposed Ellen White's leadership and opposed Ellen White's teachings. Then in 1854, we had a time-setting splinter group. I think this was the last one. From 1844 to 54, for about 10 years, they kept setting new dates for the Lord to come, recalibrating those 2,300 days. And finally, 1854 was probably the last significant time-setting movement. But it splintered off a group of Adventists into that movement. 1844-45, Owen R.L. Crozier, school teacher, fine young man. Crozier and his friend Hiram Edson lived in Port Gibson, New York. In a neighboring community was a doctor. And the three of them studied together, Dr. Frederick Hahn, H-A-H-N. The three of them studied night after night during the winter of 1844-45. You see, on October 23, of 1844, the day of great disappointment. Don't ever say that October 22 was a day of great disappointment. It wasn't. That was a day of great expectation. Nobody was disappointed on the 22nd. That was the day he was to come. The disappointment began at 12:01 a.m. October 23, legal time. That's when the disappointment began. And that night, that Tuesday night, Edson and Crozier were out in Edson's near-empty barn. Now, on October 22 and 23, the barns in New York State and the barns in New England, where these first Adventists largely came from, are not empty. They are full. The harvest has already been taking place. But the Millerites, they didn't believe that they could harvest their crops. People would say, and with a measure of truth, hey, you don't really believe Jesus is coming October 22. If you did, you wouldn't harvest your crops because you aren't going to need food. When Jesus comes, He's going to feed you. And so, lest it be a negative witness to their message of the imminent coming of Jesus, they didn't harvest their crops. They left the potatoes undug in the ground, the corn in the shock, unharvested. And so, Edson's barn was nearly empty. And he and Crozier went out there and they prayed. Prayed all night, the rest of the night. After midnight, Jesus didn't come. And early the next morning, Wednesday, October 23, the day of the great disappointment, they were walking through the cornfield of Edson's yard, his barn, his farm, walking through the cornfield when all of a sudden, I don't know whether Edson had a vision like prophets have or whether it was an illumination, but he suddenly was looking up into heaven almost transfixed, and Hiram, Owen Crozier came and said, Hiram, what is it? And in a voice filled with awe, Hiram Edson says, I don't know, Owen, what it is, but maybe the Lord is already beginning to answer our prayer explanation, what went wrong. Because at that point, he began to understand that there was a sanctuary in heaven. The cleansing of the sanctuary had something to do up there rather than down here. And so for the rest of that winter, from October 23 on into March of the next year, 45, in the evenings, Dr. Hahn would come over to Edson's house, Crozier would come over to Edson's house, and they sat there by coal oil lamp, kerosene lamp, didn't have electricity in those days, night after night after night, studying out this idea of the heavenly sanctuary. And by March, they came to some conclusions, and they said, we've got to share these conclusions with the other Millerites. That they need to know, too. This explains the disappointment. Well, who's going to write it out? Well, Edson said, I'm a farmer. I'm not a trained writer. Dr. Hahn said, I'm a practicing physician. I don't have time. Edson was a school teacher. You can guess who was chosen to do the writing. And he did. And it was published in the Day Star, Day, Dawn, a couple of magazines. And a year later, Ellen White would write, a year ago I was shown that Brother Crozier has the right slant on this, and furthermore, that it was God's will that Brother Crozier write this out. Wouldn't you like to have a prophet tell you that something you did, which you felt was a spiritual duty, was the will of God, that God was behind all of that? That was 1845. 13 years later, Owen R.L. Crozier turned his back on the doctrine of the heavenly sanctuary. He turned his back on the doctrine of the seventh-day Sabbath, two of the pillar doctrines of this church. You know, we got 5 pillar doctrines in this church. They're all important, but there's 5 pillar doctrines. And the sanctuary in heaven and the Sabbath sacredness are 2 of the 5. And he walked out, and he went over and joined the Sunday-keeping Adventists, the Advent Christian Church, which, by the way, did their first organizing in the year 1860. They're kind of like a twin sister to the Adventist Church. You see, when the Millerite movement broke up, it broke up into 4 groups. The first group, and the largest group, people gave up religion totally. They were embarrassed, horribly embarrassed. People were making fun of them. They felt the Lord had tricked them, and they walked out of religion altogether. The second group were the time setters, and they lasted for about 10 years, and then they finally petered out. Then the third and the fourth group were those who still believed that the coming of Jesus was imminent, that it was near. They wouldn't go any closer than saying near. And the one group were a little small group of maybe 150 people up in New York State and New England who were keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. And the other group were the Advent Christian Church, the people who continued keeping Sunday. And there's still a few of them around. I visited one of their churches near Boston some years ago. It was an interesting experience. Well, 13 years later, Owen R.L. Crozier turned his back on the Sabbath, turned his back on his own explication of the doctrine of the heavenly sanctuary, which Ellen White said, the Lord showed me. He had it right. Now, she didn't endorse every eighth subdivision of a point, but basically he's got the right slant. Marian Party, middle 1860s. A defection led by two officers, the first president and the first secretary-treasurer of the Iowa Conference, Snook and Brinkerhoff. They led a defection. They had a three-part message. Their three-part message was no organization, which is remarkable because you'd think conference officers of all people would want to keep organization alive. That's their job. No organization, no heavenly sanctuary, and no Ellen White prophet. And they broke off and they formed something that today is called the Church of God, parenthesis, Seventh Day. Moses Hull, 1857. Moses Hull was converted in a tent campaign. In those days, we didn't have little 2 and 3 week reaping meetings. An evangelistic campaign run 3, 4, 5 months and preaching nearly every night in the week. Moses Hull was converted toward the middle of one of these campaigns, and before the campaign finished, he was up there spelling the preacher who needed, evangelist who needed a night off every so often. Moses Hull would get up and preach. He was a very powerful pulpit speaker. He was an extremely talented young man, and he was an able debater. Now, you can't imagine what it was like before they had television, much less what it was like before they had radio, much less what it was like before they had motion pictures. But back in those days, people would go to a debate for recreation and entertainment and amusement. And Moses Hull became a very adept debater. And there are techniques that you have to practice if you want to be a good debater. In fact, one of the reasons Ellen White warned our ministers, don't get into debates if you can avoid it. Now, if the cause of truth demands it, okay, debate. But don't get into a debate unless you absolutely have to, because the techniques and tactics of debate are more geared towards scoring points. Because they take a vote at the end. Somebody wins and somebody loses. The work of debaters is more calculated to score debate points than to arrive at truth. But Moses Hull, he thought, well, she doesn't know what she's talking about. He was a very good debater. And his specialty was in debating spirit mediums. And he would debate them and defeat them practically every time. One night, he was in, and they held these in public schools, buildings, because they didn't have town halls much in those days. One night, Moses Hull was making a great big pile driver point. And one of the techniques and tactics of debate is the dramatic pause. You make a great big point, and then you let it sink in with a dramatic pause. So Moses Hull made his great big pile driver point, and then he was silent in a moment of dramatic pause. And in that moment of silence, Moses Hull heard a voice that completely demolished the argument that he had just made. And he probably thought within himself, well, you win a few and you lose a few, and I guess I blew it tonight. But to save face, he gamely carried on, and it quickly became apparent that his opponent had not heard the voice. The opponent was dumbfounded, discomfited, didn't quite know how to go about it, hesitant. At the end of the evening, it became clear that the audience hadn't heard the voice. They voted Moses Hull was the winner of the debate. And it just blew his mind. So he went out. Moses Hull was an impetuous sort of chap. And so the next day he went outside of town, a little hill. Went outside of town, prayed and fasted all day. Prayed and fasted to God. All day long, nothing happened. The second day he went back on this little hill, fasted and prayed all day the second day. Second day he fasted and prayed to the devil all day long. Nothing happened. Third day, he fasted and prayed. And the third day, he prayed to the spirits. And everything happened. And in just 7 short years, Moses Hull came into the Seventh-day Adventist Church and went out of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and joined the spiritualist movement. And in 1948, when they brought out their centennial book, because you see, the spiritualists in America view 1848, the Fox sister, the Rochester rappings, as they were sometimes called, the spiritualists believe that 1848 was the beginning of modern spiritualism in the United States, and we have no quarrel with their date or the event. But in 1948, they brought out a centennial encyclopedia, and there's a whole page biography of Moses Hull in there, and one of the leaders of the spiritualist movement said of Moses Hull, he was the finest evangelist that we ever had in the entire 100 years of modern spiritualism. Now, something interesting. Ellen White wrote him 2 letters, 7 months apart. November 5, 1862 and June 6, 1863. You'll find them in Volume 1 of the Testimonies, page 426 to 437. And the interesting thing, if you're familiar with the Testimony series, you know, they don't mention names in the Testimonies, 9 volumes. Brother A, Sister B, Brother C, Sister D. When they get to the end, those letters had absolutely no relationship to the surname of the people. Dr. Kellogg would not be Brother K, he might be Brother Z. When they get to the end of the alphabet, they start all over again. They wanted to hide the identity of the people. In the volume 1 of the Testimonies, there are 11 pages, Testimonies to Elder Moses Hull. It's the only person in all 9 volumes who had his name prominently displayed. And Ellen White wrote to him, as a mother would warn an errant child. She pleaded with him. She says, Moses, I see you as standing on the brink of a great precipice with a great chasm opening, yawning before you. You're right on the edge of that precipice. You are beginning to totter back and forth. You look like you are beginning to lose your balance. She said, Moses Hull, if you take one more step forward in the path you are taking, you are going to go over and down to your destruction. And she said, by the way, if you go, you won't go alone. You'll take others with you. And her prophecy proved to be correct even in that particular point. Moses Hull. A shaking in the early Adventist church. There was a man named Dudley Canright. He was one of our most able speakers. And when he left us after about 28 years of service, he was 47 years of age in 1887 when he left. He was a forceful speaker. He had a polemical style, writer. He had an in and out experience. He was mercurial. He was emotionally unstable. When everything was going great, why, Dudley Canright was going great. And he was one of the most powerful preachers. When he left, it would be like losing HMS Richards Sr. and Jr., losing George Vandeman, losing William Fagel, founder of Faith for Today, and losing Mark Finley, all of them rolled up into one. Can you imagine the catastrophe that would be? When Canright went out, that's what the church faced. He was our ablest speaker. But sometimes he had very thin skin. And sometimes if somebody criticized him for something, well, he would pout, and I'll take my dolls and toys and go home, that sort of thing. And the brethren would come, they'd throw their collective arms around him. Dudley, come on back. We didn't want to hurt your feelings. Well, all right. And he was in and out, in and out, in and out. Finally, he stayed out and wrote 2 books, one attacking our doctrines and one attacking our prophet. One time when he was still within the Adventist church, he was sought after by Sunday-keeping churches to preach in their congregations. And there was one of them over there on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, right opposite Lake Michigan. And they asked him to come. I guess the pastor was going on vacation or something. And he said, I want you to come and preach to my people on Sunday night. He says, I want you to preach on the reward of the righteous, heaven. So there was a young boy who worked in the stock room of the Review and Herald whose name was Drury Revis. And he said to Revis, I want you to come with me and I want you to sit in the gallery on the front row of the balcony right in the center. And he said, I want you to do a rhetorical critique of my presentation. What were the good points? What were the bad points? How can I improve? So Revis positioned himself in the gallery. Canright was introduced. Within moments, he had that entire congregation in the palm of his hand, and he kept them there. And he rang the changes about the glories of the world to come. When the meeting was over, the people crowded up to the platform, praising him to the skies, telling him what a wonderful sermon it was, how blessed they were. And Revis is waiting over here, 16-year-old kid. And they went out, after all the people left, they went out, across the street, Lakeshore Park. Revis sat down on a park bench. He tells us the story in his own autobiographical account, which is entitled, I Remember. And he sat down, and Canright still had so much adrenaline in his body that he had to pace up and down to work off the nervous energy that he had generated. And he said, okay, Revis, what were the good points and what were the bad points? And young Revis, who loved this man, admired him deeply, was proud to be a friend. He said, DM, they went by initials in those days. DM, oh, he said, it was so great. He said, I completely forgot what I was up there for. I was so captivated by your presentation. And then Canright said something that shook young Revis to his very roots. He said, Revis, if it weren't for the Sabbath, I could be a great preacher. And this young 16-year-old boy, stock keeper in the Review and Herald stock room, wise beyond his years, had the courage to speak up to the greatest preacher in the Adventist church of that day, 1887. And he said, Brother Canright, if you give up the Sabbath, you will go back into the obscurity in which the Sabbath found you. It was a prophecy that, sadly, became all too true. And when he left to become an independent Baptist preacher, Canright started writing his books, the first one attacking our doctrines, the second one attacking our prophet. And he hired a young lady whose name was Carrie W. Johnson, student at Battle Creek College. She needed some way to earn tuition money. He hired her to take dictation. She knew shorthand. And he would dictate these books to her. She later, and it was published in 71 by the Review and Herald, she wrote her autobiography, I Was Canright's Secretary is the title of it. The churches let it go out of print. I think they ought to bring it back. And the reason I think they ought to bring it back is because evangelical bookstores are still selling Canright's two books, one attacking our doctrines and one attacking our prophet. You'll still find those books in print. And I think we ought to put Carrie Johnson's autobiography in there. Just a few months after she wrote that book, I had 3.5 hours with her and interviewing her in the campus center on the campus of Andrews University. And I talked to her about her experience in working with Canright. And she told me personally how that he would pace up and down as he was dictating this diatribe against our doctrines and this diatribe against our prophet. And she said he would work himself up into such a spasm. She says, I thought he was demon-possessed. And he may have been. I don't know. But there are two interesting things about the end of Canright that still puzzle the historians in this church. Canright, with his brother who never left the church, went to Ellen White's funeral in Battle Creek. It was her third one. You know, she had 3 funerals. The first funeral was on the grounds of Elmshaven, her estate in Northern California, at the bottom of the hill. PUC is located up at the top of the hill. The second was at the Richmond, California camp meeting, the California Conference. They didn't have Northern, Central, Southern, and Southeastern in those days. It was just California Conference. They were having their camp meeting. And so they stopped there. The train stopped and they took the casket off and they had a funeral there. And then they went back to Battle Creek for the big funeral. And after the funeral sermon had been delivered, I think it was done by A.G. Daniels, President of the General Conference, people queued up, lined up, and they opened the lid of the casket and they filed past to say their last respects. And Canright and his brother walked down and looked, and then they kept moving. And as they came around, Canright said to his brother, let's wait until everybody else is gone. I want to go back for one more look. Okay. So they waited, and then the 2 Canright brothers were the last ones to walk down the aisle. And old D.M. Canright put his hand on the coffin and said in a voice that was shaking with emotion, there is a noble woman gone. And yet the book that he wrote about her, to defame her, to demolish her, to destroy her, is still being circulated today. Well, what's the other curious thing that the historians can't explain? If you go to Otsego, Michigan, a town famous for 2 things. Because Ellen White had her first major health reform vision Friday night, June 6, 1863, in the home of Aaron Hilliard, a layman there in Otsego. But on the edge of town, there's a cemetery, and D.M. Canright is buried there. And I was there not long ago. We had one of our friends from Russia, a young lady who was going to Andrews University, and we were helping her in her expenses. And I took her up there, and we looked at Canright's grave. The marker is old, and many rainy seasons have washed it almost blank. But if you look carefully on the gravestone, it says, Elder D.M. Canright. Elder. For 20 years, a Baptist, 30 years, a Baptist, independent Baptist preacher. They don't call themselves elder. They call themselves reverend or doctor. They don't call themselves elder. Elder D.M. Canright. It's almost as if Canright, for he left instructions for this. It's almost as if he wanted to be remembered. The last thing that he wanted to be remembered by his church was that he was once an Adventist preacher. But let me tell you, when Canright left in 1887, it was a shaking in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Well, John Harvey Kellogg, brilliant physician, author, inventor. If you go to the information building, the visitor center of Advent Village, they will show you some of his inventions. If you go to Cereal City, they will show you some more of his inventions. He had them patented. Some very interesting and remarkable inventions that he made. Tremendous surgeon. One time a patient went to the famous Mayo brothers who started the Mayo Clinic, Rochester, Minnesota. And the Dr. Mayo was taking the medical history of the patient as he was examining him and checking his abdomen. He said, "Oh, I see you've had an operation by John Harvey Kellogg." They hadn't gotten that far in taking down the medical history, and the patient said, "How'd you know?" "I didn't tell you that. How'd you know?" Well, he says the incision, small, short, just like they ought to be. Kellogg was a very famous surgeon among... In fact, one of the things he was angered about by Ellen White, one time she wrote him a letter. If I'd gotten a letter like that, I would have framed it. The letter said, "Dr. Kellogg, you were operating in the surgery of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and it was the first case you had ever had of this particular kind, and you were extremely nervous. You'd never had this kind of an operation before." She said, "I saw Jesus was standing by your side, and he put your hand, his hand, over your hand holding the scalpel. And you sensed it. And suddenly all of your nervousness evaporated. And you went quickly and efficiently, as he always did in his surgical procedures, and finished the operation in record time." And he was very unhappy with that. He says, "People won't think I'm a very good doctor. They're going to give the credit all to the Lord, who should better receive the credit." But he was offended by that. He was offended by her rather straight talk. You know, Ellen White called a spade, friends. She did it kindly, courteously. But she told people where they stood and where God stood. She told Kellogg that his tactics, his methods, some of his objectives, and certainly some of his strategies were absolutely wrong. And he didn't like it. Kellogg could not be crossed. Any young doctor who worked for him, if he ever crossed Kellogg, was written off immediately. Might as well just leave and go practice medicine somewhere else. They lived in fear of this man. This man, with his tongue, could wither an opponent just with words, cut them to ribbons. Nobody ever wanted to get on the wrong side of John Harvey Kellogg. Tremendous man. Second superintendent of the Battle Creek Sanitarium. Tremendous public relations man. I mean, this was the man who brought to the Battle Creek Sanitarium the largest institution of its kind in the United States in the 1880s and 90s and the 1900s, who brought such men as Henry Ford, such men as Harvey Firestone, such men as J.C. Penney. John D. Rockefeller I, founder of the Standard Oil Empire, came to him one day and offered him $1 million for a transplant, organ transplant. He said, "I need a new stomach." You believe me, Kellogg would love to have taken that $1 million, but he couldn't because we didn't do organ transplants at that time. That would develop a century later. The 100,000th patient to register at the Battle Creek Sanitarium was William Howard Taft, former President of the United States. Kellogg was sharp when it came to public relations. He knew how to bring these big people in and get publicity and notoriety for the Battle Creek Sanitarium. Well, Albion Fox Ballinger, minister, religious liberty leader, missionary to Wales and Ireland. And he had some views about the heavenly sanctuary which have been bruited about in this church, in this country, in the last 20 years. He didn't believe there was a real sanctuary up there. He believed that whenever the Bible or Ellen White was referring to the heavenly sanctuary, it was simply a rhetorical device, a metaphor, to personify some great truths of the atonement. And Ellen White heard about this strange teaching, no real sanctuary. She called him down to the General Conference headquarters, Tacoma Park, Washington, D.C. Now, I don't think there was a stenographic transcript. You know, usually when Ellen White talked to people, there was a stenographer there taking down every word he said, she said, he said, she said. So nobody could ever go out and say, well, Ellen White said something that she didn't say. I can imagine in my own imagination how that interview went, probably sitting alone in this room. Sister White kindly said to Ballinger, Brother Ballinger, Albion Fox Ballinger, I understand that you don't really believe that there's a real sanctuary. No, Sister White. When you speak of it and when the Bible writers speak of it, it's a rhetorical device to personify some of the great truths of the atonement. But it's not a real place. Well, Brother Ballinger, have you ever been there? Well, of course, no. But Brother Ballinger, I have. And in early writings, you've got a vivid description of her first visit. She was in the courtyard, she was in the holy place, she was in the most holy place, and Jesus himself was her guide. Wow. She says, Brother Ballinger, you haven't been there. Folks, somebody who has been to a place is a more authoritative speaker than somebody who just read about it. She was there. And she says, Brother Ballinger, there is a real sanctuary, and Christ is our high priest. Ballinger was angered, left with his brother and his father, both of them defrocked ministers, as he was also, and they formed an organization called the Gathering Call to fight Adventism. Alonzo T. Jones, A.T. Jones, Elliot Wagner, both of them on the right side of the issue, righteousness by faith, at the Minneapolis 1888 General Conference session, supported strongly there by Ellen White. But later, for different reasons, both of those men left the Adventist church. Talk about a shaking. And last but not least, Franklin Beldon. In our old church hymnal, we had about 24 or 25 of Franklin Beldon's gospel songs. In the new one, there's at least a dozen Franklin Beldon songs. They didn't put some of my favorites in the new hymn book that was in the old hymn book, were in the old hymn book. Franklin Beldon, nephew of Ellen White. His mother, Sarah Harmon Beldon, married Stephen Beldon, a worker in the Review. And by the way, like father, like son, Franklin Beldon rose to be superintendent of the Review and Herald publishing plant by 1888. He also had some of his aunt's literary ability. There must be a literary gene that was in that family, because with his cousin, Ellen White's son, James Edson White, the oldest of the two surviving of the four babies that she bore, two grew to manhood. One died at 16, one died before 1 year of age in infancy. And they put out the first Adventist hymn book, Edson White and Franklin Beldon. And Beldon claimed that the Review and Herald owed him some author's royalties on some of his music, and they claimed they didn't. They said, we're paying you a salary, and we're entitled to the output of your pen when you are on company time. These are still problems that have to sometimes be dealt with in the Adventist church today. And he became very disgruntled. He wrote to his aunt, Ellen, and he said, would you please intercede? Boy, would she have clout. If Ellen White went to bat for her, you probably get what you were after. And she wrote him back, I've held the file copy of that letter in the White Estate vault in my own hands. And she wrote to her nephew and said, Frank, you may be right and the Review and Herald may be wrong on this one, but I'm still not going to get involved, because even if you are right in the point that you are espousing, you are wrong in the attitude that you are manifesting. And I'm not going to get into it. And he was angered. Beldon would go to camp meetings. Now, in those days, camp meetings were evangelistic meetings. Beldon would go to an evening camp meeting, evangelistic meeting, and with his organist, pump organ, with his organist, he would sit on the front row with a tablet and a pencil in his lap. The meetings were evangelistic. The presentations were doctrinal presentations. He knew our doctrines. He would listen, to use the expression of the Methodist Church, the preacher called out his text. Beldon would listen as he called out his text, listen to the first introductory remarks to get the drift of where the chap was going in his sermon, and then tune him out. And while the man was preaching the sermon, Franklin Beldon wrote a gospel song on the subject of the evening sermon. He also wrote the music for it. And when the sermon was over, Beldon would go up on the platform. The organist would take her place at the organ with a score of music she'd never seen before in her life. And Franklin Beldon would sing a song that encapsulated the essence of the message of the evening. It wowed the people. It would today. But he became angry with his aunt. He began to slip. He began to shake. The shaking. That's what we're talking about. It's the final shaking of Adventism. It was going on back then. And she wrote him a letter, and I held a copy, the file copy of that letter in my hand not too long ago. She used an incredible metaphor. Someday I'd like to write a book about the metaphors of Ellen White. Some of them are fantastic. And as far as my research shows, she only used this metaphor 3 times in her correspondence. In the middle letter, the second of the 3 was to her nephew Franklin Beldon, and she warned him, don't become like one of Noah's carpenters. What did she mean? Noah's carpenters built the vessel that could have saved their lives. There's an irony there. When it didn't matter, when the sun was shining, when the raindrops were not falling, they were inside the ark. They were laying the floor, making that little window, putting up the rafters, the beams, shingling the roof perhaps, putting a roof on. When it didn't matter, they were on the inside of the ark. But friends, when it did matter, when the raindrops started falling, they were not on the inside of the ark. They built the vessel that literally could have saved their lives. Now, please don't go too far. Metaphors cannot be made to stand on all fours, and don't try to make it prove more than it does. Ellen White never believed that membership in the Adventist church would save you. She never taught that. But what she was saying was Franklin Beldon helped to build the ship of Zion that could have helped him to make his way into the harbor of peace at last. But as far as we know, he did become one of Noah. Now, we can't judge motivation. We can't judge character. We're told not to. In 1942, just a few months before Franklin Beldon died, 2 Adventist ministers in Cleveland, Ohio, one of them, Carlisle B. Haynes, one of our veteran evangelists, one of our powerful evangelists in the 1920s and 30s and early 40s. Carlisle B. Haynes came to Cleveland to hold a big campaign, and there was a young ministerial intern, 1942, named Kenneth Wood. Kenneth Wood would later become the editor of the Review and Herald, and when I worked in the White Estate, he was the president of the Board of Trustees of the White Estate. He told me this story personally. This is not hearsay. And Elder Wood said, I was just a young beginning minister then. And Haynes came to me one day and he said, I have a check from the General Conference Treasurer. We bought some of Beldon's memorabilia for a historical museum. And rather than just have the GC Treasurer send the check in the mail, he said, I had him give it to me. It'll be an excuse to go have a spiritual meeting with the man. So they went, knocked on the door. He came, looked through the glass door, didn't open the door. He knew who they were and he didn't want to talk to them. He was embittered in his old age. They said, Frank, we brought you some money. Oh, the door opened. Walked in, handed him the check, sat down. After a few moments of inconsequential twaddle, just social chatting, they came around to the purpose of their meeting and they said, Frank, how is it with your soul? And he understood clearly what they were doing, where they were headed, and he put his hand up to stop them. I have just one question for you, gentlemen. All right, what is it, Frank? Do you still believe in that woman? And they knew very clearly to whom he was referring, his aunt, the prophet, Ellen White. And being men of probity, of honor, of integrity, they could not equivocate. They could not waffle. They had to say, yes, Frank, we still believe in that woman. The interview was ended without saying another word. Franklin Beldon got up out of the chair, walked over, opened the door, and gestured to them that they were to leave. And Franklin Beldon went to his final rest. I presume he's buried some cemetery in Cleveland, Ohio today. Did he die as one of Noah's carpenters? I hope not. That man who made such a wonderful contribution to the hymn book of our church? I hope not. But there was a shaking going on in the church in those days, and the early shaking would become a final shaking. I remember in 1980, just the year before I joined the folks in the White Estate as in my last salaried position for the church, 12 and a half years. I'm still working for them. I'm just not getting paid now. Maybe I'm getting paid what I'm worth. And 1980. Can you remember back 20 years, 21 years, 1980? The church was shaken. We had a big theological controversy with an Australian minister named Desmond Ford. His concerns were the heavenly sanctuary, which, like Ballinger, he didn't believe there was one. 1844 was a non-event. No investigative judgment. He thought we were all off on that. Desmond Ford took out a whole generation of preachers in Australia. For 20 years, he was the chairman of the Bible department of Avondale College, and his students worshiped the ground he walked on. You go to Australia today. I was there just a couple of years ago. Even in retirement, they keep bringing me back out there for camp meeting. And you look at the ministers of our church in Australia today. We've got some young fellows coming along, and we've got some old guys like me, superannuated with white hair. But that middle-aged group that you would normally expect to see evaporated. We lost 200 ministers in the South Pacific Division alone. I lost 12 guys that I trained for the ministry at Pacific Union College in my 11 years of teaching there. I know what Paul meant when he said to some people his day, I've wasted labor on you. I worked hard for you, and now you've done what you've done, and I wasted my labor. I can understand why Paul would be concerned like that. Well, Desmond Ford was worried about the heavenly sanctuary, didn't believe there was one. Investigative judgment, all of this is nonsense. Ellen White's inspiration, well, yeah, she was inspired, but only in a little degree. He has 8 categories: history, science, chronology. Has 8 categories in things she wasn't inspired in, according to him. Then we had a man named Walter Ray who wrote a book called The White Lie, intended pun. Ellen White, he didn't understand her. And so often when we don't understand something, we make mistakes. And Walter Ray made tragic mistakes and wrote things that have turned people off to the Adventist church. That was a second problem in 1980. There was a third problem. There was an Adventist physician who got involved in a financial scam and took millions of dollars, some of the church money, even though the General Conference warned our entities not to invest in the man's schemes, building post offices, among other things. A triple whammy in 1980, and in a meeting somewhat like the one we're in tonight. Because tomorrow, if we have time, we'll have a question and answer period at the very end. If you have questions about what I'm presenting, or Ellen White in general, Adventist history, I'll try to answer them. Lady stood up and asked Dr. Robert Olson, who was my boss both as chairman of the religion department at PUC and then later again head of the White Estate. She said, Brother Olson, these 3 things, is this the shaking? And I still remember Bob's almost inspired reply. He said, Lady, I don't know whether it's the shaking or not, but it certainly is a shaking. And it was. As early as 1882, she looked ahead to the final shaking of the church. And she said, a storm is arising that will wrench and test the spiritual foundation of everyone to the utmost. Therefore, avoid the sandbed, hunt for the rock, dig deep, lay your foundation sure, build for eternity, build with tears and heartfelt prayers. 20 years later, coming on, the shaking is accelerating. Just as soon as the people of God are sealed in their foreheads, it's not any seal or mark that can be seen, but a settling into the truth, both intellectually and spiritually, so that they cannot be moved. Just as soon as God's people are sealed and prepared for the shaking, it will come. Indeed, it has begun already, 19:2. Nature of the final shaking? She said the faith of individual members of this church will be tested as though there were not another person on the face of the earth. And then she used again her memorable metaphors, 2 of them. One from the world of agriculture. This would be understood because most Adventists were farmers. One from the world of agriculture. She spoke about a shaking of the sieve. a refining, winnowing process in every church. The separation of the chaff from the wheat. And I want you to notice her choice of words in that last expression. I'm going to come back to this tomorrow. Separation of the chaff from the wheat. She didn't ever say separation of the wheat from the chaff. It was the chaff that was separated from the wheat. And I tell you why I'm mentioning that, folks. I'm going to talk about this tomorrow morning and again tomorrow afternoon. I get mail in my mailbox every other day or so from organizations saying the Adventist church has become spiritual Babylon. Come out of her, my people, and bring your tithes and offerings with you when you come. Come out of her, my people. They talk glibly, earnestly, they're very sincere, about a remnant of the remnant coming out of this church. Ellen White never spoke about separating the wheat from the chaff. It was always separating the chaff from the wheat. The wheat stays in, friends. It's the chaff that is blown away at the end in the time of the harvest. Well, that's enough for tonight. I don't want to be any party to that man who is known as the one who wears out the saints of the Most High. Tomorrow morning at the 9:30 hour, we're going to talk about the 4 reasons, the 4 causes, if you please, of the final shaking of Adventism. Then in the afternoon, at the 11 o'clock service, we're going to talk about the extent of the shaking. And then in the afternoon, specific limitations upon the 2 Israel metaphor that she used, and which some of those who purport to follow her writings have been misusing in the church. And you need to understand that clearly. 6 reasons Ellen White gave why there isn't going to be a remnant of the remnant coming out of this people. Would you stand with me for a benediction prayer? Father in heaven, thank you for that marvelous prophetic voice that for 70 years was heard in this church, and whose writings continue, like Abel, she being dead, yet liveth and speaketh to us. Thank you for this remnant people. Thank you for the task that you've given to us to do, to perform. Thank you for the privilege of Christian fellowship. And Lord, thank you for these who've come out tonight when there are other things they could have been doing. Give us a good night of rest. Refresh our tired bodies. Bring us back again tomorrow morning for our 2 services in the morning and then our afternoon service. And again, we ask for the teaching ministry of your Holy Spirit, that the human element may be lost sight of and only Jesus and his beautiful truth may be seen. To that end, we thank you in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen.
You have been listening to another special American Christian Ministries presentation. This is a digital recording for optimum sound quality. International copyright, all rights reserved. To order a copy of this or other presentations, or for a free catalog, please call toll-free 800-233-4450. International calls dial 717-652-7000. You may also order from our secure website at www.americanchristianministry.org. There you will discover the largest selection of authentic Adventist preaching available. You can trust ACN. There's no compromise here. If American Christian Ministries has been a blessing to you, why not take a moment just now and send us a note or an email with your testimony? We'll share it with the speakers and volunteer workers to encourage them. Your prayers and continued financial support are very important to ensure the continuation of this ministry as we help prepare America and the world to meet Jesus Christ. He is coming soon.